She turned, her dark brown hair catching the glint of the setting sun, and looked straight at me. I couldn't move. The beach was buzzing with people. Laughter, music, the distant crashing of waves. But in that moment, the world shrank to just her and me. She smiled, an infectious grin that seemed to light her up from within. I smiled back, and before I knew it, I was weaving through the crowd toward her. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. It was as if something, call it fate, call it impulse, had taken hold. "Luke," I said, introducing myself, trying not to sound too eager. Her eyes sparkled as she reached out a hand. "Rachel," she replied, her voice bright yet somehow grounding. And just like that, with the warmth of her handshake and that captivating smile, everything in my life seemed to shift. We spent the rest of the evening side by side, sharing stories and laughter as though we were old friends. There was something magnetic about her energy. She was adventurous, vibrant, like she'd bottled up the very essence of life itself, and was daring me to take a sip. That night, I couldn't stop smiling, thinking about her laugh, the way she danced barefoot in the sand, and the feel of her hand in mine. From that night on, it was as if the world had given me a new axis to spin around. We became inseparable, jumping from one adventure to the next. We traveled, hiked through misty trails, went to every party we could find. Friends joked that our kind of passion could never fade. And in my heart, I truly believed it. But even the brightest fires can cast shadows. A few years into our relationship, Rachel decided to go to Las Vegas with some friends for the weekend. It was nothing unusual. She was always the social one, the one who thrived in crowds and spontaneity. But this time, things felt different. Her texts were short, her responses delayed, and when I called her one evening, she answered with an uncharacteristic tone. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice too bright, too casual. "Hey," I replied, trying to shake the feeling twisting in my gut. "How's Vegas?" "Oh, you know, the usual," she said, laughing lightly. "Lots of dancing, a few drinks. Nothing crazy." But something about the way she said it didn't sit right. There was a faint strain in her voice, like she was forcing the casualness. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my own insecurities flaring up. Then, a couple of nights later, I received an anonymous message. The words were brief. "Do you know where she really is?" Attached was a short video. My heart hammered as I clicked to play it. The screen filled with blurry, flashing lights, bodies moving in sync to the beat of some loud club music. And then I saw her, Rachel, laughing, arms around a stranger, her lips brushing against his. The video was shaky, but there was no mistaking her. When she got home, I waited for her in the living room, the message and video open on my phone. The moment she walked in, she froze, noticing my expression. "Luke, what's wrong?" she asked cautiously, already sensing that this was more than just a casual conversation. I held up my phone without saying a word, showing her the video. Her face paled, her mouth parting in shock. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, a touch of defensiveness creeping into her tone. "Does it matter?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Rachel, what the hell is this?" She took a deep breath, crossing her arms and looking at the floor. It was just a stupid mistake, a meaningless kiss. "It didn't mean anything, Luke. I swear." "Didn't mean anything?" I repeated, feeling the words sink in. "So why'd it happen at all?" She looked up, her eyes pleading. "I was drunk, caught up in the moment. I didn't even know the guy. It was a stupid, meaningless kiss. Please don't make this bigger than it is." I felt the weight of her words, felt them tugging at the parts of me that still believed in us, in the life we'd been building together. After a long silence, I finally nodded. "All right, I'll believe you, Rachel. But this better not happen again." She stepped closer, reaching out for my hand, her face softening. "It won't. I promise." I wanted to believe her. For a long time after that, I convinced myself that I did. After the Vegas incident, we tried to move on. I threw myself into my career, and Rachel was more focused than ever on building hers. We got married, bought a cozy house in the suburbs of Los Angeles, and soon, Jamie and Emma came into our lives. Becoming a father changed me in ways I never expected. I felt a deeper sense of purpose, a commitment to my family that ran stronger than anything else. Watching Rachel with the kids, I thought maybe that one night in Vegas had just been a lapse, something from the past we'd left behind. But as the years went on, things started shifting. Rachel's real estate career took off. At first, I was thrilled for her. She was hitting her stride, becoming the successful, independent woman she'd always dreamed of being. But her work began swallowing up more and more of her time. Late evenings turned into whole weekends, and her phone was always buzzing with calls and texts from clients. One night, I was sitting at the dining table with Jamie and Emma, helping them with their homework. Rachel had called to say she'd be late again. Jamie, now 12 and unusually perceptive for his age, looked up from his book and asked, "Why isn't Mom here?" "She's always working." I glanced at Emma, who was too busy drawing to notice the tension, and sighed. "Your mom's job is just really busy, buddy. She's got a lot of clients who need her." Jamie's face twisted in frustration. "Feels like she's never here anymore." Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, Rachel finally came home. She looked exhausted but refreshed in a strange way, her hair still slightly damp. "Long day?" I asked, watching her as she set her things down and avoided my gaze. "Yeah," she replied, sighing deeply. "You have no idea. The market's just crazy right now." "Who was the last client?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She hesitated, glancing at me before answering. "Zach. He's looking at some high-end properties. Takes a lot of time." I nodded, trying to ignore the chill creeping up my spine. But as I watched her settle into bed, something felt undeniably wrong. The late nights became routine. Rachel's career in real estate had skyrocketed, and with that came longer hours, weekend showings, and client dinners. I tried to support her, to be understanding. After all, she was doing great work, and I was proud of her. But somewhere along the way, we seemed to slip into two different lives. Most nights, it was just me and the kids sitting around the dining table, helping Jamie and Emma with their homework, getting them ready for bed. One night, after yet another call from Rachel saying she'd be late, I decided to plan something special. I wanted to remind us both of what we had, of the life we'd built. So, I set up a romantic dinner at home. Candles on the table, her favorite red wine breathing in a decanter, and her favorite flowers in a small vase by her plate. When she walked in, her face softened with surprise. "What's all this?" she asked, smiling, though there was a trace of hesitation in her voice. "It's just us tonight," I said, pulling out her chair and gesturing for her to sit. "Thought maybe we could spend some time together, like old times." She laughed lightly, running her fingers through her hair as she took her seat. "Luke, this is sweet," she said, her eyes darting around the room as if trying to settle in the moment. "I didn't realize you had this planned." As we ate, we fell into easy conversation, almost like the early days. She told me stories from work, some of her clients, the quirks of the real estate world. It felt like we were reconnecting, like we were still the same people who'd fallen in love on a beach years ago. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that this was a fresh start. But then, in the middle of her story, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced down, and I saw a faint, involuntary smile touch her lips before she quickly turned the phone face down. She looked back at me, her expression momentarily unreadable. "Sorry, it's just a client," she murmured, brushing it off, trying to laugh. I forced a smile, pushing down the unease that had begun to creep in. I wanted this night to be perfect, to be about us, about rebuilding what had felt lost. But the shadow of that moment lingered, quiet and unspoken, and as we sat in silence, I realized that something fundamental had shifted between us. After that dinner, things seemed to settle into a familiar but distant routine. Rachel continued her demanding schedule, and I focused on my job and the kids. Jamie was growing up fast, now 12 and sharper than I sometimes wished he'd be. He noticed things, little things that I thought I was hiding well, the tension in the house, the quiet moments when Rachel wasn't around. One evening, as I was tucking him in, he looked up at me with a serious expression, his brows knit in thought. "Dad," he began slowly, "why is Mom always working now? She used to be here more." I tried to keep my face calm, not wanting him to feel the unease that had been gnawing at me. "She's just really busy with work, Jamie. Real estate can be like that sometimes." He didn't seem convinced, but he nodded, looking away, his jaw tightening. Sometimes it feels like she doesn't want to be here. I paused, feeling the weight of his words, knowing there wasn't much I could say to make him feel any better. Hey, bud, it's not like that. Mom loves you and Emma. We both do, more than anything. He looked back at me, his face set in a look that was older than his years. Then why don't you and Mom just tell the truth? His words hit like a punch to the gut, and I found myself at a loss. He was right. There was a truth we were skirting around, something unspoken that had lodged itself between Rachel and me, and now it was bleeding into our kids' lives. I forced a smile, pulling him in for a hug, but I could feel the weight of his question lingering, heavier than ever. And Emma, sweet little Emma, who was only 8 and still so innocent, would ask questions that broke my heart. "Daddy," she said one night as we were reading a bedtime story, "why doesn't Mommy come home with us after school anymore? Did I do something wrong?" I hugged her tightly, pressing my lips to her head, feeling the weight of everything we'd left unsaid. "No, baby, you did nothing wrong. Mom's just busy with work, but she loves you very much. Don't you worry about that." She nodded, but her little arms wrapped tightly around me, as if she were trying to hold on to the reassurance I couldn't fully give. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my children's confusion and the fear of what might lie ahead. For the first time, I wondered if I could keep pretending everything was fine, for their sake if nothing else. The tension in our home grew thick, like an unspoken fog settling into every room. Rachel's late nights had become routine, her phone practically glued to her hand, and she was never far from a text or call. I'd lie awake in bed, listening to the sounds of her returning home hours past midnight, her footsteps careful and quiet as if she didn't want to disturb anyone. I kept my eyes closed, pretending to sleep, but inside, every inch of me was alert, bracing for I didn't even know what. One night, as I was washing dishes after dinner, Jamie came into the kitchen, his face tense. He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "Dad, do you know about Mom and that guy? Zach." I nearly dropped the plate in my hands. My pulse hammered as I turned to face him, my voice barely steady. "What do you mean, Jamie?" He looked down, his hands fidgeting. "I saw her with him, after school last week. They were at that cafe down the street." He swallowed, and I could see the pain in his eyes. "They looked close." I didn't want to believe it, but why does she need to see him so much? I felt a surge of anger, not at Jamie, but at Rachel, and at the helplessness in my son's face. I struggled to find words that wouldn't betray the roiling inside me. "Jamie, sometimes adults make mistakes. I'm sure it's not what it looked like." But he wasn't satisfied. "Dad, I'm not a little kid. I know what I saw." That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying Jamie's words over and over. The cracks in our lives were widening, and it was starting to show in my children's faces. The next day, as if on cue, Rachel texted me to say she'd be working late again. My frustration boiled over, and I found myself firing back a text I never thought I'd send. "Are you with Zach?" There was no response. For hours, I waited, each minute stretching into an eternity. When she finally walked through the door, well past midnight, I was sitting in the living room, waiting. She froze when she saw me, her face flickering with surprise and something else, guilt. "Luke," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't," I interrupted, standing up. "Just don't lie to me." She looked down, her hands twisting nervously, and for a second, the air felt so thick I thought I'd choke on it. "It's not what you think," she murmured, her voice shaking slightly. "Then what is it, Rachel?" "Because the kids are starting to notice. Jamie saw you with him. For God's sake. What are you going to say to them?" Her face crumpled, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. We stood there, staring at each other in silence, the weight of every unspoken truth pressing down like an anchor. Finally, she let out a breath, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen, Luke." The admission hung in the air, more damning than any explanation she could have given. And in that moment, I realized that the life we'd built, the family we'd held so dear, was starting to fracture beyond repair. Her words were like a hammer, each one chipping away at the foundation we had spent years building together. I stood there, watching her, feeling anger and heartbreak swirl together in a way that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead, all I managed was a low, pained question. "Why, Rachel?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "Why would you do this to us?" To Jamie and Emma. She took a shaky breath, looking away, unable to meet my eyes. "I don't know, Luke. I got lost. Somewhere along the way, I lost myself. I don't know who I am anymore." I scoffed, shaking my head in disbelief. "Lost yourself?" "Rachel, you didn't lose yourself. You lost us. You left your family behind, and you dragged me into this mess, leaving me to try to explain things to the kids." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she looked like a stranger, a broken version of the woman I had once fallen in love with. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you or the kids." "Then why didn't you stop?" I asked, my voice rising despite myself. "Why did you keep lying, night after night? Do you know what it's been like for Jamie? For Emma? They're already feeling the cracks you left behind, Rachel. Our son doesn't trust you anymore, and Emma keeps asking if she did something wrong." Rachel covered her mouth, a muffled sob escaping as she shook her head. "Please, Luke. I know I messed up. I know I can't fix this easily, but—" "No," I interrupted, feeling a wave of finality settle over me. "You can't fix this, Rachel. You chose to let us fall apart, bit by bit. And now we're left to pick up the pieces alone." We stood there, locked in silence, both of us knowing that the words we'd spoken were the last pieces of a broken truth we couldn't ignore any longer. Finally, I turned away, feeling the weight of every choice, every betrayal settle onto my shoulders. That night, I knew our family would never be the same. The quiet tension couldn't last forever. I knew that, and Rachel did too. But the final blow came sooner than I expected. I decided it was time to confront the situation head-on. I wasn't going to keep living in this fog of half-truths, and my kids didn't deserve to live in it either. I needed the truth from Rachel, not whispered apologies, not late-night excuses. Just the truth. So, I came up with a plan. Rachel's parents were visiting for the weekend, and they'd asked to go out to a nice restaurant in town. They hadn't been around much lately, and I wasn't sure what they knew, if anything, about what was really going on. I decided to take a gamble, a desperate one. I picked a popular spot downtown, the kind where Rachel often met her high-end clients. I wasn't even sure if Zach would be there, but I knew Rachel's patterns well enough by now. If I was right, she'd see him. I arranged the seating carefully, making sure Rachel's parents and I would have a direct view of the door. When we arrived, Rachel seemed a bit on edge, her gaze flicking around the room, and I couldn't help but notice the way her shoulders tensed. And then, right on cue, Zach walked in. He looked comfortable, like he'd been here with her before. Rachel froze, her smile faltering as she caught sight of him. She tried to play it off, introducing Zach as a client, but I didn't give her a chance to brush this under the rug. "Funny, Rachel," I said, loud enough for her parents to hear. "It seems you've been seeing Zach quite a lot lately. Didn't you have dinner here just last week?" Rachel's parents exchanged worried glances, their faces registering the unease that was now unmistakable. Her mother reached out, placing a hand on Rachel's arm. "Rachel, what's going on?" Rachel tried to laugh it off, stammering through a weak explanation, but I cut her off. "Why don't you tell them, Rachel?" I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Tell them about the meetings and the late nights and the business trips." Zach shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing he'd been pulled into a scene he wanted no part of. He muttered something about needing to go and quickly slipped away, leaving Rachel standing there, her face pale and her eyes darting, searching for an escape. Her father's voice was heavy with disappointment. "Rachel, is this true? Is this really who you've become?" Rachel's shoulders slumped, her gaze falling to the floor, and in that moment, I saw the weight of her actions finally settle on her. There was no more hiding, no more dodging questions. We all sat in silence, the air thick with disappointment and disbelief. I looked her in the eyes one last time. "You didn't just betray me, Rachel. You betrayed our kids. We were your family. Without waiting for a response, I stood up and walked out of the restaurant, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and relief. I had fought for this family, but I couldn't keep pretending for the sake of a facade. It was time to move forward for myself and for Jamie and Emma. In the days that followed, reality hit hard. Rachel moved out, staying with a friend while we figured out the next steps. I was left with the task of explaining the sudden shift to Jamie and Emma, breaking down the complex pain into words a child could understand. I dreaded it, but I knew I couldn't put it off any longer. One evening, after I'd tucked Emma in, I found Jamie waiting for me in the living room, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. I sat down next to him, trying to find the right words. "Jamie," I began, swallowing hard, "there's something you need to know. Your mom, she's made some choices that are really hard for us to understand. She won't be around as much for now." He looked away, his jaw clenched, and then he said something that broke my heart even more. "She wasn't there when we needed her anyway, Dad." Hearing that from him, my bright, observant boy who'd already grown up too quickly, made me realize just how deeply he'd been affected. I wanted to shield him, to soften the impact of what he'd seen and heard, but the truth was he already knew. Later, as I sat with Emma, I kept my voice gentle. "Emma, your mom isn't going to be home as much. She's staying somewhere else, but she still loves you very much." She stared at me with wide eyes, clutching her stuffed animal tightly. "Did I do something wrong, Daddy?" I held her close, feeling the ache of her question. "No, sweetie. This isn't because of you or Jamie. Mom and I just have some things to work through, but I'm here, and I always will be." As the days turned into weeks, I knew I had to prepare for the legal side of things. I met with a lawyer, gathering evidence of Rachel's actions. Her texts, the pictures, everything I'd tried to ignore until now. I didn't want this to turn into a bitter battle, but I needed to protect my kids. I needed to make sure they'd be okay, that they'd have stability in the middle of this mess. Rachel tried to sway friends and family, painting herself as someone who'd felt neglected, casting me in the role of the detached, uninvolved husband. But the people closest to us had seen the truth, and most of them stayed by my side, understanding the full weight of what had happened. I remained transparent with them, never speaking poorly of her, but letting the facts stand on their own. It was enough. In the courtroom, I presented everything: the timeline, the messages, the signs I'd overlooked for too long. The judge listened, his expression unreadable, and when the ruling came, I was granted primary custody of Jamie and Emma. Rachel's visits would be limited, her time with them supervised until things stabilized. It wasn't a victory. Nothing about this felt like winning, but it was a relief, a chance to finally begin the process of healing. With the kids now settled in a routine, I started building new traditions for us. Every weekend, I planned outings from small hikes to movie nights, and little by little, we began to find a rhythm. There were days when Jamie would finally open up, sharing bits of the anger he'd kept inside, and Emma, though more forgiving, would still sometimes ask why things had to change. Through it all, I held on to them, knowing that no matter how much Rachel's choices had hurt us, we were still a family. A new kind of family, maybe, but one rooted in resilience and honesty. And as we forged ahead, I began to see glimpses of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Months passed, and a new normal settled over our lives. The house, once filled with tension, was quieter now, but it was also calmer. Jamie's anger had slowly softened, though there were still days when he withdrew, lingering sadness etched on his face. Emma, ever resilient, seemed to bounce back, embracing the small routines we'd created: Sunday breakfasts, Friday game nights, and our newly beloved family camping weekends. Then one evening, Rachel showed up at the door unannounced. Her face was drawn, and she looked different somehow, tired, maybe regretful. I hadn't expected her, and neither had the kids. Jamie stiffened, glancing from me to her with an expression I recognized: guarded, wounded. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice low, as if she already knew she had little ground left to stand on. I nodded, leading her to the living room, Jamie and Emma trailing behind. Emma's face lit up momentarily, but Jamie stayed back, crossing his arms defensively. Rachel looked at him, a flicker of sadness crossing her face. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice trembling. "I know I wasn't there when I should have been. I know I hurt all of you, and I can't take that back. But I'd like to try to be a part of your lives again, if you'll let me." Jamie's expression hardened. He looked away, then met her gaze, his voice steady and cold. "You weren't there when it mattered, Mom." The words hit her, and I saw her flinch. But Jamie didn't look away, standing his ground with a quiet strength that both broke and made me proud. Rachel looked at Emma, a hopeful smile on her face, but even Emma, who usually tried to see the best in everyone, didn't move toward her. Instead, she looked to me, as if seeking reassurance. "Rachel," I said gently but firmly, "I think we're all trying to move forward here. The kids have been through a lot, and they need time. We all do." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes, and in that moment, I saw her as she truly was, someone who'd made choices she couldn't undo, who was facing the full weight of her actions. She left quietly, glancing one last time at Jamie and Emma, who remained rooted by my side. After she was gone, there was a long silence. Jamie finally turned to me, his face a mix of relief and sadness. "Is she going to keep coming back, Dad?" I looked at him, knowing that no matter what happened, he deserved the truth. "I don't know, Jamie, but we're going to keep moving forward. Together." In that moment, I realized we'd reached a turning point. Rachel's attempts at reconciliation might never fully bridge the distance she'd created, but we didn't need to dwell in that pain anymore. Jamie, Emma, and I had carved out a new life, one based on honesty and love, and that would be our anchor moving forward. As the days continued, we grew closer. We took road trips, tried new things, and laughed more often than we ever had before. And even though the scars remained, we learned to wear them as reminders of what we'd endured and of the strength we'd found in each other. In the quiet moments, as I watched Jamie and Emma flourish, I understood that we had truly become a family again, a family that had survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side.